Hey, welcome to another video. Today we are going to be discussing 4 key things that I've learned as a toddler dad that I just did not expect. I do not have much experience being around toddlers prior to having kids, and even my wife had minimal experience too. But there are some expected, some surprising things that you should just know, and this video will help you learn and set some expectations being a toddler dad and getting through some really rough times. Before we jump into it, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Chris. I have 2 boys under 5, so one is about to be 3 years old and the other is about to be 5 years old, and they are probably your most classic boys you've ever seen. They are super loud. They love to run around, wrestle, play with trucks, toys, Legos, sand, run around outside, play with other kids, just like anything you can think a boy does, these boys do. We wrestle constantly, and yeah, they've been a handful. And to say that it's been the most stressful time of my life is probably an understatement. There's been some really rough times. I'm also a Christian. I am a software developer, 9 to 5. I have 2 hat businesses, and my wife and I, we have a good marriage. We have our ups and downs, but we're doing pretty great. So that's a little bit about me, and I hope that gives you some context to where I'm coming from and how we decide to parent our kids. Shoot, just spilled water on my iPad. Look at this cute picture. That's them on our flight that we took just in Christmas time, wearing headphones and watching a movie on an iPad. So it was actually not too bad of a flight. Okay, we're ready. Let's jump into it. The first thing, which I kind of just mentioned, is being very loud. My kids are so loud. And I started experiencing this with my firstborn. When you go from baby stage, it's just crying and screaming. And sometimes that's gets loud and it's overwhelming. But then there's this next level that they hit as they get as an older baby where they're just the loudness is at 11. It's so loud, it kind of cripples your whole body. And that continues on until I don't know when. It's still continuing on. My oldest is now 5, and he still is super loud sometimes, but my 2-year-old, almost 3-year-old, is insanely loud. Literally just yesterday, the past few days, he's been going through something where he's just so loud. I have to literally walk out. If he's in a timeout, sometimes we put him on the stairs, sometimes we put him in his room. If he's so insane, we try to put him in his room to not disrupt everything and everybody. But then other times he's just loud everywhere. But he was so loud in his room, I had to step out and walk away, come downstairs because it was so loud. I could not handle the noise level. And this happens, and it happens quite a lot. If you're anything like me, it will change how your body functions. It literally pierces your soul. It's been so loud times that I have to walk outside and walk down the street to chill out because it's just so loud. Everything in me feels overwhelmed. And that's just something I just didn't expect with having kids. I've always been fine with loud sounds, going to a concert, listening to music loud. Now I hardly listen to music at all. Sometimes I'll just have my headphones in and be working. No music at all. Most of the time, if I have headphones in, I'm not listening to music. They're just there to keep the quiet. And yeah, I don't have music on passively in the background. And maybe oh, this kid, he's got something messed up with his head. Maybe, but this is just something I didn't expect. That loudness kind of just takes over your life. And even when they're not screaming and having tantrums, it can still be super loud with them talking. Everything is at this level. There's no inside voices when you're a toddler. It's just one level, loud, and then louder. So I guess 2. Loud, louder. Two things. So how do you handle that? I'm not sure, besides give yourself some grace to separate yourselves from your kids if you need to, and have your spouse take over if things get too overwhelming. That's probably my only advice there. The next thing we come up to is language. Now, language, I speak English. Kids, they don't know what that means. You have to teach that to your kids, which is obvious, but there's this part where you go from being a baby to speaking English. And the in-between, I didn't realize how long and like how difficult it is sometimes. So whenever you start learning to talk, I can't even remember how old it is, like a year and a half or something. I guess they start saying mommy and daddy like before they're 1, and then it takes a while for them to say a few words, and then they start forming sentences. But by the time they say like 5 words to speaking full sentences, that time is like, I don't know, a year maybe. And it's difficult because they're learning words and they're basically learning nouns like dog, run, dog there. Like very simple sentences to start out. And then it gets more complex, like dog is running there. And a lot of times they will try to say something to you and you don't know what they're saying because they haven't formed their words properly. And so you have to learn how to decipher their toddler talk. And you'll notice this when you get around like grandparents or other friends, and your kid will say something and they're like, I have no idea what they said, and you'll interpret it for them. You're like, oh, well, I know what they said. It's obvious because I've been around them for months. But they won't know because it's really difficult to understand what your toddler is saying. So if you're not spending enough time with them, you're not going to understand them. And so you got to give them grace and yourself grace. And they will get frustrated if you don't know what they're saying. So one way to solve this is to repeat what they're saying back to you. So say your kid says, dog, run, fast. And they say it and it's like kind of confusing. And you're like, I'm not sure what they said. Or even if you are sure, you can say, dog, run fast. And they'll be like, yeah. And you do this for like a year. Their sentences. You want pizza? Yes. And you just repeat these things to them. Like over and over again. And just over and over. They say something, you repeat it. And obviously there's a weaning off of you doing this, and you don't have to repeat everything, but a lot of times it is helpful so that they understand that you understand. And when they think that you don't understand, they get mad, and you have to make sure that they do understand. I'll get into discipline in just a little bit, but that also plays a huge factor in how language is developed, in how you set proper expectations and what they say, and you saying it and telling them no or telling them yes. And that can get really difficult too. So along with language, we got, the frustration and teaching them language. Along with that comes defining words, right? You have to define words and what they mean. And there's been a lot of times where they say a word and I don't even know what it means. And I have to think of what it means and either have to look it up or have to, just spend time thinking about it for a few seconds and then be able to define it to them. And sometimes it's like this idea is too complex for them to understand, so I break it down to something simpler. That's maybe not entirely correct, but it's correct enough for them to understand. I'm trying to think of an example, but I can't right now, so we're going to move on. And the last thing I'll say about language is time. When they start learning time, it's super confusing. So if you say yesterday, they have no idea what that means. So my 3-year-old now is like, yesterday we went to the beach. Well, we went to the beach last summer. That's over a year ago. And he says yesterday. And so telling him what yesterday means is weird. It's the day prior to today, that was yesterday. But before that, it was not yesterday. Maybe it was a week ago, maybe it was a month ago, maybe it was a year ago. They just don't have that concept in their brain. And so teaching them that it just takes a long time for some reason. Even though you can say no, that wasn't yesterday, that was a year ago. They'll still say yesterday for the next thing. We went to school yesterday. No, you went to school 3 days ago. Or you can say yes, maybe we can do that in a couple hours. And then they'll ask 2 minutes later, can we do that? No. It hasn't been 2 hours. One way to help with that is to get a clock. I have a little clock somewhere. But get a little time clock that you can set the hour or minutes, a whole hour, and do 15 minutes. And they can see it go. And it can ding. We use that sometime with eating. And it helps them understand time a little bit more. And we also have a calendar that we kind of show them this is the week, this is the month. And try to get that time in their head. So that is something you have to teach your kids stuff, but it's just something that I hadn't really thought through. And I don't remember learning it, so why would I remember someone teaching it to me, you know? Okay, next up on here is the listening, and that goes along with language, but listening's a little bit different. There's a few things here I wanted to mention, and I'm just looking at some notes here on my iPad. Isn't that pretty sick? So one is eye contact. So whenever you're talking to your kid, you want to make eye contact with them, because if they are not looking at you, they're probably not going to hear you, more than likely. Or they have an excuse to not listen to you because you're not looking at them. But when you make eye contact, you know that they know that they know. So that is one really important thing. And this goes along with the disciple thing that I mentioned earlier that I'll mention in a second. Another thing is my oldest, if we are trying to speak to him, sometimes when he's in trouble, sometimes just in general, he'll be playing. I'll say eyes, or like with my little one, I'll say eyes. With him, I'll say look at me, or I'll just call him out Xander and make sure that he's looking at me. But then there are times he's looking at me and trying to do something else and looking away, trying to do something else. One way I found to fix that is to get him to like stand up in front of me and put his toys down, put his arms by his side, and like look at me. And we do that usually when it's in trouble, so that he isn't distracted by everything and I can actually speak to him and he is listening to me. Now, if he's just playing and he's trying to look at me and looking at something else, I'll say, put your toys down and listen. And he can just put them down for a second, turn, listen, go back to it. And so that has been a really helpful thing just in the last few months with my oldest. The other thing that I wanted to mention about listening is they don't really understand context. So like my son was messing with my wife this morning, and he was like, there's a chair, right? A chair, couch, table. This is kind of hard to demonstrate, but he was going in between the chair and the table and like hitting my wife. And my wife was like, stop doing that, basically. He was like, okay. And then like 5 seconds later, he did it again. And I was like, maybe he just doesn't understand what she's saying. And so I told him, Xander, Mom told you to stop walking in between the chair and the table, and then he didn't do it after that. So sometimes they just don't understand the context that you're saying it in. They could be playing with their Legos and you say, stop playing. And they could just play with their Legos because they just don't understand what you're saying. So you can say, just be clear, define what you're saying. Son, stop playing with your Legos. Or like they do something, they hit their brother, and it's like, don't do that. Instead of saying don't do that, say, hey, do not hit your brother in the head. Like, it's okay if you're wrestling him, but don't hit him in the face. Just be clear, be simple, make sure they make eye contact with you, and help them understand. And so this goes into the next part that I wanted to bring up is discipline and setting correct expectations for discipline. I'll probably do a whole video on discipline because it's been something that's like an unknown for me. Like I grew up very, very much so where if you do something wrong when we were little, no, stop doing that. If you do something maybe a little worse, you get a spanking. And then if you do, I know when we were like super little, we got timeouts. Get put in our room, spanking sometimes, and then, go on about your day. It's over with. So it's very like, get disciplined, move on with your life. And this is wrong, get disciplined, move on. And so I didn't really know what I was going to do as a father. And a lot of people, if you're watching this and you're a new dad, or you're just going into your toddler years and you don't know how to do that, I'll make a different video on things that I found that's been helpful. But I wanted to bring this up on this because setting expectations with disciplining. There's not, you go from like becoming aware as a toddler, and teaching or like disciplining them to them like always being disciplined. Like if you tell them to not hit their brother, they're going to hit their brother at some point, even though you told them not to. I'm not saying like that moment, but probably the next day, probably the next day after that, probably the next day after that, until they learn that they shouldn't hit their brother, until they learn the boundaries of your home. And so it's important to set expectations because my dad always says, like, no means no. The first time I say it, you either do it or you're in trouble. And so I understand that completely, and I completely agree. But there's also this learning point of them learning what no means and the boundary, and then actively going against that. Because they are going from knowing nothing, like they have zero awareness. They're going from being a baby and getting their needs met at everything to you're trying to make them into a functioning human. And it takes years for that to happen. And so I understand like how much you have to say no to your kids, like all the time. No, like don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And not everything is about like making sure they don't do bad things, but it's it's constant. Like it's been constant trying to tell my sons, when I say it, that's what I mean, and you do it, that's it. I've done that probably every day for a couple years, like saying that exact thing. I say it one time, that means you do it, and that's it. It's been every day I say that about something. I tell my son, Xander, stop hitting your brother in the face. Yes, sir. And then 10 minutes later, smacks him in the face. Go to the stairs. Xander, do not hit your brother in the face. Yes, sir. All right. We move on. It's like you have to do it constantly, and you have to constantly solidify that boundary to them. Like even if they don't listen, even if they are not being obedient, you have to constantly solidify that boundary to them. And it's not a matter of are you being a good dad or not being a good dad. It's not about that. It's about like you have to set the boundary and you have to keep the boundary. And if you don't keep the boundary, then they're going to continue pushing the boundary. And so even if they don't do it on the first time, you have to set it somehow, which means you have to punish them somehow. And I'm not going to get into the whole spanking thing in this video, but it's just something I didn't expect to have to do, to constantly repeat myself, to constantly discipline, to constantly set that boundary, and to let them know what the boundaries are in this house and how we behave as humans. So if you are not aware of that, your expectations can be like, why does my kid like stop not listening to me? Why are they continuing to do this, even though I'm continuing to tell them no? Like, it's because they just have to learn it. Like, they have to learn, and you have to continue to teach them. They have to learn, you have to teach. Like, it's both and. And if you stop teaching, they're never going to learn. If you stop teaching, they're never going to learn. So keep teaching, keep setting the boundaries. Yeah, that's it. If you have any questions about that, let me know in the comments, and I'll write a better thing for discipline, and I'll write a video on how I go back disciplining my toddlers, if that would be helpful for you listening. But this last one here, this would be number 5, I guess, is how not to ruin your kids. And I have another video on this, how not to ruin your kids. It's basically about how therapy has persuaded our culture to overanalyze our emotions and how it impacted me as a dad to feel like I would ruin my kids by doing something. So if that's something that's interesting to you, you want to know how not to ruin your kids or how you actually aren't going to ruin your kids, go watch that video. And I'll see you over there. Alrighty. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up, give it a subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions. And if you're a dad and entrepreneur, check out the newsletter down below. Sign up for it. And that's about it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later. See you out there. Toodaloo.